Hey, Elliot, what's up?
Not too much, Josh. What's up with you?
Life is good. Life is good. I think that I'm headed in the right direction, but some things kind of came to my attention recently, and I thought it would be fun to bounce this thought process off of you. And I'm calling it the hardest thing that I've had to deal with in early retirement. So, being 14 months in here, I've had a little bit of time lately to kind of reflect on what's gone well and what hasn't gone well, and I'll save my issue, if you will, to just in a couple minutes. And maybe I thought just for fun we could go through some of the common reasons that people might struggle with either moving into early retirement, quitting their job, or the troubles that they might have once they reach early retirement. I'll kind of give my take on some of these, and I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are as well. So some of these were items that I came up with on my own, and then I did a quick search just to come up with a list of others. The first one that came to my mind is that somebody would struggle within early retirement because they're transitioning from a saver to a spender. That's not something that I really feel like I had an issue with. And now, in all fairness, my wife still works, so we're not on a typical drawdown strategy, but we have drawn down slightly from our cash reserves, and it hasn't really bothered me too much. There's given us pause a little bit here and there. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what a lot of people say is this is a big struggle is moving from the mindset of however long you've been on the path of just being in accumulation is just, yeah, everybody likes seeing their net worth or their assets just grow and grow and grow. There's something pleasurable in that experience to see, yeah, hey, look at how much money that I'm sitting on, right? But then all of a sudden you got to flip the switch and start going the opposite way. And of course you don't want to just spend it down to zero on the flip of a dime, but for whatever time horizon that you have, make that money last. So yeah, I can certainly see this as a problem in early retirement or just retirement in general.
Yeah, traditional retirement. If you don't have that fixed income, which was a term that I learned what it actually meant from you a couple episodes ago, and you're just relying on your own investments and savings, and it's going down and to the right instead of up and to the right, that could certainly give someone some anxiety and reason for some level of stress.
Absolutely.
Another one, this is one that I think people often will cite as maybe they're people outside of the fire community, but boredom is people will think, what are you gonna do with your time? What are you gonna do all day? What would I do with all that time that I have available? And certainly has not been an issue for me whatsoever. I never considered that it would be. I always knew that I would have plenty to keep me occupied. I take that back. I did have a bit of a momentary concern as I was getting very close to my finish date that would I get all these projects that I had made a list of around my house completed, and then what would I do after that? And turns out 14 months later, I think I've completed two things. So
You're trying to tell me that your list of lists isn't fully complete, Josh?
not even close.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think that this is a concern for a lot of people. And some people will say, well, boring people only get bored. And I don't think that that's really a fair shake at it either. Change is hard for everybody. And if you have been working a career for 10, 20, 30 plus years, it's hard to turn around and disrupt what is the status quo, right? And so I know that we talked about this a couple of episodes ago about, hey, do you need to retire to something or are you just retiring from something? It is a bit of a choose your own adventure, know yourself, and realize is that going to be a problem for you or not? And I think it is worthwhile to just sit down and go through that mental exercise. I remember reading a book on stoicism, and I forget the exact term that they use, but I think it's along the lines of negative actualization or something along those lines. So don't hold me to the exact phrase, but it is essentially just imagining the worst possible outcome in a situation, trying to plan how you would react to that particular situation, and then saying, oh, hey, like that's not so bad, or here's what I would do in this situation, right? So if it ever does come to fruition, you at least have planned and you've thought about it. But then the probability of that worst case scenario actually happening is probably much, much lower than we ever really think that it is. And so everything comes out much more rosy on the other side. Is, if you're, to put it simply, if you're always a pessimist, then everything comes out rainbows on the other side, right?
Yeah, you gave a hint in there of what I'm dealing with, and maybe you can kind of connect the dots there. But I'll definitely continue to save that until we get through this list. But you're kind of onto something. And I'm curious as we go through this list if there's, so I'm, like I said, 14 months past or into early retirement. You're some number of months or at least no more than a couple of years away from your end date. And I'm curious if any of these things are like on your mind or giving you any level of pause or concern at this
Yeah.
point.
I mean, certainly we've talked about this on previous episodes of, hey, different decision points that could affect end dates and everything else like that for me. So, hey, it could be as short as today if now I guess my working day is over, so it's not today, but I mean it could be as short as right away to, like you said, a couple of years from now, but in, at least in my mind, it is under a year from now. And so I certainly have taken the time to kind of plan out what I think that quote unquote perfect day looks like. Or I read Brad's newsletter from Choose FI today that came out, and I'm not sure if you read it, but what he referred to was, he called it the Tuesday Project, is that his girlfriend Erin and him are referring to it as the Tuesday Project. So what does your normal Tuesday really look like? I think that's what we're trying to plan for. Is it's not this grand vacation or this insane life that you're living, but what does your normal Tuesday look like? And I thought that was pretty insightful to say, yeah, that's what we're all trying to get to, is not see what the ceiling is on our expectations, but really setting the floor on what our expectations really should look like for any given day.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that sometimes to the outside world, and maybe even to you or to me that's living it, it might look or feel somewhat boring, that, you know, just that typical Tuesday if you don't have something significant going on. And that's okay. I mean, I think that for me, I have days like that where it's like, maybe I didn't really do a whole lot today, or it wasn't anything that it's going to be remarkable or that is somebody else is going to look at and be like, wow, you retired for that. You know, I mean, today is a good example. It is Tuesday. I took a long walk this morning, went and got my hair cut. Talking to you now, that's the extent of it for the most part, Elliot.
That's right. I mean, and what a luxury that truly is, right? I would say that, you know, also in that same newsletter today, one of the 1% betters at the end of the newsletter was about somebody buying an adjoining property to their existing property, and they bought it at like a tax auction, and I think that they just bought it for the explicit purpose of bulldozing it so that they essentially had unobstructed view to sunsets and things of that nature. And so the memory dividends that cost, which was fairly insignificant, will actually provide, you know, I thought was very insightful, was it's those kind of decisions that don't show up in a spreadsheet. It's hard to say, how can you value having a slow day of just waking up, getting a haircut, having a friendly conversation, and how quality of a day that really is? Because I think that's the measure of success that we're all trying to look for is we shouldn't be trying to optimize for money, because ultimately that's a problem that we've solved for. Is we're trying to optimize for happiness now. So how many good days are we having on average
Yep.
throughout a year?
I like that. The next one that concerns people and maybe why they would avoid early retirement or could be concerned once they reach it is healthcare expenses. This is one that I know that we've talked about a little bit just in passing, and I've kind of looked at the numbers, and I think at least as things stand right now, it's certainly solvable. You can go through the ACA. It's going to look different for everybody depending on what their age is and where they live, but there's certainly options out there. Once you know what the cost of that is, you can plan for that. You can plan to get the subsidies, which is going to offset your cost somewhat. And I think we can go deeper on that one, but I know that was one that was always in the back of my mind as well. Since I left, we were on my insurance plan, which was significantly better and cheaper than my wife's, and now we're on that. And it's like, we could go on the ACA and save money and probably get better health care than what she's offered through her employer, which is terrible, but that's kind of the way it is.
I think this always comes down to the fear of the unknown, right? Is that ultimately, if the headline that everybody is fed is, healthcare in the United States is so expensive, and the ACA is terrible. It's just not clear, right? I mean, even for myself, I know that I don't know what ACA costs would be for my family of five today. I have a whiteboard right to my left here, and one of the items up there is ACA costs, so that I can plug it into my buddy projection lab and have yet a more fine-tuned picture of what costs would really look like in a drawdown scenario. Is trying to be more and more accurate so that the picture that I have is a better representation. But like you said, all it takes is doing some homework, and ultimately you find out it's really not that difficult. People do it every single year. There's tons of people that use the ACA and covers them as good or better than plans that
Yep.
people are on right now.
And I would venture a
So
guess that with your family size and just knowing the ballpark of what your annual spend would be, or annual, I guess, income would be, you would be eligible for the full subsidies with no problem whatsoever. And I would imagine your healthcare cost would be pretty minimal in the grand scheme of things.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. And I know that to be true as well. I know it's based off the federal poverty level, that it's 400% at the federal poverty level, and then it's based off the number of people in your household. There's umpteen billion different directions to go along that, but like you said, everybody's
hmm
situation is unique and different.
The next one, this one I know we've talked about several times. I never felt like it was a issue for me, and that's loss of identity or purpose. And I put a star by it on this list because upon further reflection, I was thinking about it from a different perspective, and I thought, I never really identified as a I don't even remember what my title was, head of production planning, I think is what they called me. And I never really cared to share that with the outside world. I never said, "Hey, here's what I do, and I'm happy that I do it." I didn't, boast about it on social media or anything like that. I wasn't on LinkedIn really for anything like that. So I never really connected to my career, so to speak. But as I thought about it more recently, and you and I have talked about, I've struggled with being able to clearly articulate that I am early retired. So is that a form maybe of loss of identity or identity crisis to some extent? It's probably very minor, but as I thought about it recently, I was like, yeah, I guess I'm no longer an employee. I'm no longer full-time employed. And that's how a lot of the outside world, the folks outside of the fire community, kind of look at people as, if you are a contributing member of society, you're just like the rest of us. Yeah, it sucks. We're all going through the grind. And I don't remember if I told you this or not, but I actually just recently told my mom, and she didn't really have much to say about it, but I it took me a while to actually tell her. It was over a year actually, and she was like, "Oh, well, good for you, son." It was, I think, about as far as it went. But I had this worry built up in my head that she was going to be, I don't know. And she retired early too. She retired in her early 50s. So I should not have ever been self-conscious of that. But anyway, rambled on a little bit there. That's one that I think a lot of people still struggle with. My wife is one of them. I feel like she's kind of in that camp of like, hey, this is what I've done all my life. This is what I went to school for. This is what I've been passionate about since she was probably in her early teens, and to kind of completely walk away from that is something that she's struggling with.
I think it's a very real thing is that people identify in a way to fit in, right? I think it's probably the number one question for somebody who doesn't know you to ask you is, what do you do? Like, and in your response that you just kind of gave, I think it gives me a little insight into the Josh psyche is you feel like you're not a contributing member of society if you're theoretically not working for the man, right? And I mean, of course, there's any number of ways to respond to that question, and I know a lot of people in the early retirement community despise that question. But of course, like you're a business owner still to this day. You have multiple real estate holdings. You have, I mean, it's very interesting to hear other people that even don't have another business or whatever it is that have kind of severed that connection with that identity to a point. I don't think that I'm going to have any struggles by just saying, yeah, I'm retired. But I can see how that's something that people struggle with is no, it's very real. It's something that you have done for so long, and so then there is some sort of, I think a lot of people have inherent guilt in saying, oh, like, well, I'm retired. I spent my money well, or there's some inference you made a ton of money and that's the only way that you could have retired, right? Because theoretically that's the message that we're all spoon-fed is you go work a nice long career, you get paid a lot of money, you save 10%, and then eventually once you meet the magic number, then you're able to retire. Like there's no other calculus that allows that to become true. So the fact that you are doing this years and years earlier must mean, oh, well, I got paid a large sum of money, or I got an inheritance, insert other factor, and you feel like you're going to get judged by the person that asked the question.
Yeah, and this isn't the hardest part of early retirement for me, but it's funny that we could probably continue to go deeper on this one because I'm starting to have thoughts about why, like you said, that I might feel a little bit guilty about this, and depending on who I talk to. And I remember when I was a kid, I was really young, and I remember my dad had a pretty good job. He worked for Anheuser-Busch, and he made pretty good money. And I remember like his friends didn't. He was, some of the guys that he grew up with that he was still in contact with at the time were either in between jobs or just a variety of circumstances. And I just remember there was a guy that was his friend, and he'd asked him for money several times, and the guy had kids that were like my age, and my dad was very like frustrated and was like, every time I talk to this guy, he's asking me for some money. And he's like, some people work and make good money, and then other people don't, and then they want those with money to give them money. Something along those lines was the gist of it. And maybe that had an impression on me that has always kind of carried on, that is like, well, those that aren't doing well have some level of expectation from those that do well. And that's definitely very biased, and projecting that out into the world, which is unfair. But I think there's still a little bit of that residual effect of like, hey, I'm in this spot. If if I'm talking to somebody that's not as fortunate, I'm concerned that their thoughts might be, well, what can you do for me? But that's completely unfair, and I know that, but it's just like long standing carryover from something I experienced as a child.
I know we have a mutual friend that has talked about this particular topic of giving money to people, and I think it pertains to family. I don't know that friends or anybody else was involved, but especially family, right? And I don't remember his exact response, but I think it was along the lines of, "Yeah, hey, I'll give you money, but this is the first and the last time that I will ever give you money, and basically, like, this is done." Whereas he was much more generous with his time and trying to help people sort out a situation and trying to educate, trying to assist, and like willing to bend over backwards in any way possible to try and set people up to make their situation better than where they currently are. Completely willing to do that all day long. But if you're just kind of asking for, hey, I need this for this immediate ask, okay, you get once
Yeah.
and never
Yeah,
again.
that's interesting. Well, I'll move on to the next one. The old social isolation concern that people have. And I'm not necessarily an extremely social person, so this one hasn't really bothered me too much. I could definitely see that if somebody is in a situation where they're used to talking to people all day, and maybe their immediate friend group is within their workplace, that could be an issue. And if you haven't built up some level of community on the outside, whether that's friends or like we had the Choosify local group or any number of other things that you could explore as a way to put yourself out there and become more social in the real world, as they say, IRL, right? No, in the real IRW, something like that.
It's,
In
yeah,
real life. There you
in
go.
real life. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, that again, that's something that hasn't really been a factor for me. Although I'm still continuing to hint at what has been my biggest challenge. Having a lot of time alone does lend itself to having a lot of thoughts. And so I'll get to that whenever I get to my biggest and hardest challenge in a minute.
I'd be lying to say that this doesn't concern me in some ways for myself. My wife stays at home with our children, but in the fall, all three children are going to be at school during the day. So full time, like that's different. She has her own business that she runs, so obviously may be doing her own thing just the same way that Lori, continues to do her own thing. So I certainly am a social creature, so that's not to say that I struggle completely in isolation by any means, but I definitely like my social time. So having community that is outside of, yeah, certainly of work, but I mean, I think even our friends who may not be part of the Phi community, like, yeah, it's not like I can just turn around and call somebody up that also has a job and say, hey, I'm not working. Like, you want to go hang out? Like, that's not going to work out most of the time. So, yeah, I mean, I think it is an opportunity to make sure that you build community outside of work. It is an opportunity to do things that fill your cup by yourself. So, hobbies or learning or, exercise or any number of activities that can be completely, solo activities. But I think, like you said, it's really building that community that is in that same life place.
Well, I'll do my best to make myself available for you, Elliot, when that time comes. And if I have something going on, you can always come with me to paint a house or to do some plumbing or electrical work.
Yeah, well, maybe I will just sit there and sip my ties and watch you work,
Yeah,
right?
that'll work too.
Who knows? Who
Yeah.
knows what the future will bring?
The last one I'll touch on before I get to my own was running out of money. And I know that's something that you and I have talked about as well. Of course, that's the biggest concern for any retiree, whether it's traditional or early, is the fact that the amount that I have saved, is it going to last me for the rest of my life? And I think there was, throughout my saving and early retirement or financial independence journey, it was always on the back of my mind, and it was a bit of a concern. I was constantly running the numbers, and I was like, well, what if I spend this much, and what if I spend that much? And I think over this last year or so, I've really gotten a lot more comfortable with, we're not going to outspend. I mean, things can go completely sideways, let's be honest and fair there. But I'm actually in the process of working on a investor policy statement. It's the first time I've ever done something like that. I'm drafting it right now. And one of the things that I'm just going to, like, if the stock market goes, into a crash or any kind of situation that looks concerning, I'm going to have resources that I can pull up and be able to reflect on. And I just, at this point, looking at where we are in our lives, we don't have any personal debt. We don't have a mortgage. We don't have car payments, any of those things. I don't necessarily see that changing. There's always a possibility that we could have those, but I just don't see any chance of running out of money. Like, that just seems like a very far off and unrealistic thing that's going to happen. I mean, anything's possible, but I've come to terms with, it doesn't look like that's going to happen for us.
It's a good place to be, Mr. Smog. No, I would say, as obviously somebody that has seen your numbers, yeah, I agree with your synopsis. But yeah, I mean, I think this is the one that I certainly struggle with the most, is given the time horizon, given some of the goals of things that I want to do for my children, etc. This is one that certainly rings closest to home. I mean, I guess it truly is the definition of one more year syndrome. For me, is feeling like, okay, like, I get what the numbers say, and full disclosure, like, we're still not there at the 4% rule of, well, I think the question in my mind is that our expenses continue to fluctuate quite a bit. And so trying to settle on what that number actually truly is makes trying to say, okay, this is what we actually need to have, very, very difficult. And so I have run so many Monte Carlo simulations and different budgets, and saying, oh, well, if we spend X amount of money, we're totally fine. But if we spend Y money, we might be in a different spot. And of course, like, yeah, you look at year to date stock market returns this year, and it's something like 26%. Yeah, like, that's a great thing, but who knows? Maybe the 90s are right around the corner, right? Or any number of bad things that could transpire as far as stock market returns is concerned. It's just not real likely. And I know that I'm not going to be a lemming once we get to that spot. Is I'm going to continue to look at it and be like, oh, like, if we don't make a change here, then we could potentially have issues. Our friend Aubrey has presented on this the number of times, is chance of success really should be more like chance of change, I think is a better way to kind of view it and say, oh, like, yeah, actually 80%, that's probably pretty darn good for any given plan. Like, if you're at 100% or in the upper 90s, the other way of saying that is you worked too long, and you're gonna retire with way more money than, or you're gonna die with more money than you probably ever needed.
And I think another way to look at it too, and maybe what has served me well, is to maybe take a step back from the analytics a little bit and think about it more psychological. And I know you were talking about that a little bit, but for me, what has worked is, on the one hand, we don't really do the expense tracking. We tried it. We did it for all of 2025. We have an episode on that. We did it for January. You and I did. We have an episode on that. I threw it together for February and didn't really even look at it after that. And I kept meaning to get back to it. And then I have not done it since. And here we are in June. And I know by looking at how we spend money is that right now we have a certain amount that goes into our checking account every other week, and that's Lori's check. And we typically don't spend above that. We can live very comfortably on that amount of money, and we can recreate that paycheck very easily. And like I said, we live very comfortably. We're able to do most of the things within reason that we want to do. Now we're making a choice not to go put on the deck that I've talked about in past episodes that was going to cost like $60,000 because that was just an absurd amount of money. So I don't have all the money in the world to do all the things, and there's choice and trade-off. So I think that what I'm basically trying to say is there's always going to be the opportunity to flex your frugality muscle to some extent. And you mentioned, man, expenses keep going up. And like the first thing that I thought of was your windows. I know you'd mentioned to me a couple times that you put in all new windows in your home, and that's great. But that was, you could have made different choices there. Like if things were different and money was an option and you were in a situation where it's like, okay, we're going to budget to get windows this year. And then the stock market takes a dump and you're like, well, maybe this isn't a good year to withdraw X amount of dollars. So let's put that off, or let's replace half of them. Or, there's always some type of decision that can be made or trade-off in that situation. So and just like we say with the stock market, past performance doesn't predict future returns. It's similar with your expenses as well. Past performance, past expenses don't dictate future expenses. And I know that I sometimes have gotten caught up in trying to project that out. And it's like, yeah, it's reasonable, but it's going to be so lumpy that is it really that valuable, I guess.
In short, I think it gives more anxiety than any benefit that it actually provides. Yeah. I mean, you talk to people that are early retired, and I mean, I think a lot of people say, yeah, hey, maybe I'll spend like an hour quarterly. And I think most of the time it's just updating the market value of various accounts, right? Does it really benefit you knowing, hey, my internet bill went up $5 this month, as it always randomly does, because AT&T is trying to squeeze me for every penny, and it's like just waiting until I switch over to Charter, right? I think we've talked about this in enough previous episodes, is in different parts of your FI journey, like, yeah, maybe that does make sense where you're trying to scrimp and save a couple of dollars here and a couple of dollars there. And I'm not trying to downplay the value of saving. Like, if anything, cutting money from your monthly expenses has much greater gains than even turning around and making more money. But am I really getting that much out of, oh, hey, like, here's this random expense. I don't know what this is. I got to make sure that I know that it goes into this category. Like, okay, we spent $2,000 in this category as opposed to last month we only spent $1,500. Like, who cares? How is it changing my actions? Yeah. So we're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah. And I think that you said, when you cross that threshold, and again, my wife still works, so we still have that income, but I think we're both to the point now, if we can just recreate that paycheck, we're going to be fine. And I've shown that to her. I'm like, we could even give you a raise, or give us a raise, so to speak, and know that it's going to be a raise every year thereafter that we can spend. And we don't need to go through all the painstaking process of, like, here's all the stuff that we put on this credit card, here's all the stuff that we put on that credit card, because we're trying to play the points game to some extent, and then pulling all that stuff together just becomes a chore that it's kind of unnecessary, at least for me. So it's something that I've kind of walked away from. And we're like almost 40 minutes into our conversation here, and I've buried the lead. So hopefully people are still listening. The thing that I have identified that I have struggled with the most is my mental health and happiness. And that's kind of a little bit hard to say, but I've realized it more here recently, and I guess been able to kind of put a label on it. Maybe because I've had more time to myself, more time to think and all of that sort of thing. But I'll kind of go back to the beginning of early retirement for a moment, I had that honeymoon phase that lasted for about 2 months. And my granddaughter Lila was born shortly after I retired, our first grandchild. She spent 2 months in the ICU. And when she came home, we helped out quite a bit, my wife Lori and I. And that threw my world for a loop in a hurry, where we were helping take care of a baby. She was getting up in the middle of the night, sleep deprived, all that stuff for a period of time. And then that subsided. But during that time, I was struggling with sleep, and I just became like moody and irritable. And then it kind of carried over, even though like the situation had improved and things had changed and that was no longer a factor in my life. I was still like struggling. And I think it was until maybe like July or August. So it was a good 4 months later, probably around the time that we started this podcast, that I had some improvement. So it carried on for a little while. And then I was fine again, and everything went pretty well. And then earlier this year, I think it was in February, I actually think it was whenever Lori and I were on our trip, that we went to Las Vegas for 2 weeks. And I just was kind of like down and melancholy, not serious, like I wouldn't label it as depression, but just like in a funk, I guess. And I'm sure I'm probably just in some regard just dancing around the subject, but she just one day just told me, like, you don't seem happy. And I was like, it was kind of a punch to the gut, but at the same time I was like, yeah, you're right. I think just talking to her about some things, I got better. And then I'd been fine for a couple months. And then within the last few weeks, I had noticed, I think I mentioned to you that I was complaining about the weather, and I was just really feeling like I was complaining about like trivial, stupid things. And it was like really affecting my mood. I was starting to get down. I was worried about the heat and humidity that was coming. I was looking at our neighbors and like I was just like complaining about stupid things that the neighbors were doing. I was complaining about the deer in our yard eating our flowers. I mean, literally just trivial stuff. Also had some issues with family members, and then some issues with tenant. And it was just like compiling, like everything was just like adding up to like, Josh is just getting, grumpy old man is kind of what I was feeling. And I think even jokingly being labeled as by some of my family. So I sort of had a realization, and I was like, you and I have joked a little bit. You've said that these are Josh's therapy sessions, these conversations to some extent. So I'm like, let's continue that theme and carry this along, because, for the most part, we're coming up on, this will be episode 49. We're coming up on a year now that we've been doing this. And really, we talk about how obviously we enjoy the listeners and the feedback and all of that sort of thing, but it's really, the intention is just a conversation between you and I, and it's always been helpful for me, and I enjoy these conversations. So in the spirit of just trying to make the most out of life and trying to have the greatest life possible, I just kind of wanted to bring that up, because I think that a lot of us we're in a career, and it's not the career necessarily that we wanted or love, or it doesn't turn out like we wanted it to, and we're just constantly dealing with the corporate BS. We think, oh, if I could only get out of this job, I'm going to be happier. And I kind of reflected back to some points in time where I must have been dealing with this, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And I remember one of the first like self-help books that I read was called Every Day is Friday. It was by Joel Osteen, the televangelist. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but I remember reading it at the time, and it was very like uplifting, and it was trying to get you to think, have a different perspective on life. Like if you're dealing with a job that you hate, instead of saying, I have to go to work, you say, I get to go to work, because you try to use the perspective of like, look how blessed I am. There are people that maybe don't have a job, or certainly aren't making the kind of money I am, or don't have the same level of health care or benefits or whatever that this job entails. So I remember reading it at the time, and it was helpful, like to try to reframe my thinking instead of getting down and complaining about it. And then I had read some other books along the way too. There was a book called A Complaint-Free World. Have you ever heard of that one?
Nope.
It's kind of a silly take. It's this, you wear a wristband for 21 days, and the idea is that we spend way too much time complaining And we should essentially just, that's not a form of communication. It's not healthy for you or the person that you're complaining to. And I read it, and you're supposed to get a wristband, and like every time that you complain, you're supposed to switch it to the other wrist, I believe is how it worked. And I tried that, and obviously it didn't stick. It was I was good for a while. Yeah. I have all these marks on my wrist now because I was constantly changing this bracelet. And so I did a lot of that. I did some journaling, and this was all again like 15 years ago, probably when I really started out on the FI journey. And things have gotten better mostly, but I still kind of sink back into those like negative thoughts. And the more time that I have with myself, and that I'm working on these houses and there's nobody else around but me, I might be listening to podcasts or music, but I'm still like just internally thinking about things. And sometimes my brain is going in a negative direction. Like just something stupid will enter my brain. And instead of like trying to solve it or talk to myself and say, hey, that's not such a big deal, or move on to something else, I start ruminating on it. And I'm just thinking and thinking and thinking, and then it turns to like negative thoughts, whatever it might be. It could be, I'm making this up, but it could be as simple as like, well, I haven't heard from Elliot in a couple days. I wonder what he's up to. Why hasn't he? Like, again, I'm kind of making this one up because I'm talking to you, but there's like thoughts like that in my head, and it's just so silly and sort of unhealthy. But as I did a little bit of research just to try to see if this is something that other like early retirees have dealt with, I haven't seen too much of that, but I do remember our friend Carl talking about it on Mile High Fi, and mentioning that once he thought the job was going to solve all of his problems, once he quit that, and he still had to deal with himself and work through a lot of things, and that's the kind of journey that I'm on right now. So I know I've talked a lot here the last few minutes, but I've really been trying to look at how I'm spending my time and the things that I'm taking in the form of media or whatever. And so I've kind of shifted some of my direction or attention to things that are like how to complain less and how to deal with difficult people, and just trying to learn techniques and things of that nature. I've got a couple books on my desk here. The first one that I'm currently reading is called Calm the F Down. It's kind of a fun little book written a few years ago by this lady, Sarah Knight. She's got a whole series of these F books. And then I've got some Brene Brown books. I don't know if you've heard of her, the author. I'm sure that your wife has. But Lori has a lot of these books, as she's a social worker, so they're all like self-help. And then I have one called The Body Keeps the Score, which I've heard has been referenced many times in the mental health field. So that's kind of where I'm at. That's what I've identified as being like the hardest thing that I have really had to deal with. And it, like all these other things that we talked about earlier, I feel like they weren't really so much of an issue for me. But when you get to right down to it, and you have like you've solved for all these other issues, I've solved for the freedom, I've solved for autonomy, I've solved the financial aspects. My life is just pretty darn easy and great, but I still get down on myself or deal with these negative thoughts and ruminate about stupid stuff. And yeah, I'm just continuing to try to work through that. I think I'm putting in the work now and trying to like say, okay, hey, you've identified it, it's happening, let's fix it, as opposed to in the past I would just sit there and like until like Lori would notice it and say, what's going on? And then I'd have to talk to her. So I'm trying to do it for myself this time, and we'll see. I hope that it's sustainable, and I can, if I have those down days. I'm actually in the process. The last thing here, and I'll get your thoughts on this. But I'm drafting. I told you I was drafting a investor policy statement. I'm also drafting something it's a working title, but I'm calling it "It's a Wonderful Life" policy statement, where I'm putting in like all these things of like how not only I want to live my life, and like you said earlier, you mentioned the ideal day or ideal week. I'm putting all that stuff down so that I can reflect on it, not only so that I can have the intention to keep doing that, but also so that if I do have a a down day, I can pull it up and go read through it, all this stuff, and like, this, you idiot, this, you have got a great life. Stop, stop right now. Don't let it get any further than this, and get out of this funk.
Well, that's just a few things.
Heavy.
Heavy indeed. And I know that I've shared this with you and I wasn't sure if I was going to bring this up, but yeah, I mean, myself personally, I've gone to therapy in the past, and I actually within the last week or so decided that I would, independent of this conversation, decided that I was going to start going to therapy again. And really the only reason that I stopped at the time was when my sons were born. So that's now September, it'll be 6 years ago. But yeah, I mean, I think I have I have had some of the same remarks, is just feeling like I don't know why I'm, whether it's angry, moody, grumpy, just in a foul mood, but I have some of the same issues. And I would say, something that certainly has been, I would say, at least discussed slightly in the FI space is money only solves money problems, right? And so everything else is going to truly persist. And I know that Carl and Diana and a few others have gone to, I forget the name of the actual retreat, but there's a retreat that they've gone to that they've used it as a way to kind of solve kind of some of these big life issues, right? Is trying to figure out, hey, I do have this unhappiness in my life, and I want to get to the root of those issues. And so I haven't looked at it in depth, but I mean, I always view it as, hey, this is like years of therapy on steroids, right? Is that you kind of go to a camp or retreat, whatever, and try and drive to the root of what some of these issues really are. And so it is, I have a personal belief that that therapy really can help anybody, and doesn't have to be therapy either, right? Like if you're doing the actual work of sitting there reading self-help books, trying to identify, yeah, hey, this is a trigger for me, or I'm in this particular mental headspace, how do I actually react? That's completely fine. I think you're doing what you should be doing, is trying to identify the trigger and the response. So kudos to you for identifying it and trying to work through it, because I know it's a tough thing. I have also heard similar things from my wife at times of, hey, like you don't seem happy. So I mean nobody's immune to it.
Yeah, and kudos to you as well. And like you said, I know I've heard others mention that really everybody can benefit from some level of therapy, whether it's just to talk through some of the things that you're thinking about, from like almost like a coaching aspect to the full on like dealing with trauma and that sort of thing. One of the things that I've kind of noticed and I've really taken note of is that, I mean, and this is just so simple, but it's control what you can control, and then take action on those things that you can control. So very simple examples here is, as I mentioned earlier, like my neighbors, I can't control what they're doing or how they've parked their cars or what might be sitting in front of their house or whatever number of things like that. So I just need to like let that go. Like it's not hurting me. It's not hurting anyone that, any of my family or anything like that. And then, but to take it to another step, again, this is just like simple, trivial things. But if I'm complaining about the deer eating all the flowers in our yard, like I can control that to an extent. I can start trying to come up with something that can keep the deer away, or even just put in a fence to keep the deer out of the yard. So I have some level of control over those things. And again, those are just very trivial things, but whether it's relationships or whatever it might be. One of the things that I was listening to a Mel Robbins podcast the other day, and she had a doctor on there they were talking about how to deal with difficult people. And one of the things that two of the takeaways that I had from that episode, one of them was that she said that narcissistic people can change, but they won't. And I know there's often people that are in my life that I'm like, I wish that this person wouldn't behave that way. I wish that they would listen to reason. I wish I could get through to them, all of that sort of thing. And it's like, ultimately, I'm wasting my energy and I'm putting forth more effort into it than they're willing to themselves. And then another thing that stood out from that was that I mentioned earlier that I spend a lot of time ruminating. I used to say, well, I don't worry. I don't stress. I don't have anxiety, those things, but I know that I ruminate, and those ruminations are essentially, I'm just thinking of the same thing over and over again, whether it's something that hasn't happened yet or something that I'm getting ready to do, or maybe it's something that I've already done. I'm thinking through it just over and over again. It's spinning in my head to the point that occasionally it'll wake me up in the middle of the night. And this doctor said that ruminating without a solution is just depression. And I was like, whoa, maybe it was eye-opening for me that I would never label myself as being depressed, but if I'm just wasting my time sitting there thinking about, well, I could have said this, or I wish I would have done that, or I need to do this, and like all those things, I'm in some level or layer of depression and ultimately not a happy headspace.
Yeah, it's I never would have thought of it that way either, as rumination without a answer ends in depression. But I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Is that, yeah, if you're just endlessly toiling on a problem ultimately, and you don't have any solution, yeah, it's gonna upset you, and it's just that mental bandwidth that is continually trying to spin on that problem, an answer. It's going to annoy you, and it's going to ultimately stress you out.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I'm looking for ways to essentially turn that off. And another way that this is very simple, it worked last night for what it's worth, and we'll see if it works again. But I woke up in the middle of the night last night. I don't remember what time it was. And typically, if I will wake up, let's say it's 2 a.m., I'll lay there and start just thinking about things, because my brain will just immediately get active, and I'll, even though I'm actively trying to say, don't worry about that now, let's get back to sleep, it's hard to turn that off. But I heard something on another podcast where the lady said, oh, if I ever wake up in the middle of the night, I just tell myself, oh, I'm in my bed, it's comfortable, it's soft, and I get to stay here for another, 3 hours or whatever it might be. And I was like, oh, no chance that's working. I tried it last night and it worked. I remember waking up and thinking about something, and I couldn't even tell you what that was, but I remember like having a momentary bit of like panic that, oh shoot, I'm going to be awake for a while. And then I said to myself like, oh, I'm in my bed, I got my pillow, I'm laying next to Lori, it's comfortable. And next thing I know, I was right back to sleep. But yeah, I just wanted to share that because I think that that's kind of a cautionary tale to anyone, really, that if you're unhappy with the job and you think that that's your only reason for being unhappy, there's potentially more to it. And that's what I'm identifying for myself and looking for ways to figure out.
I know a campfire that you and I both attended in Florida, there was a particular topic that came up, and it was really about relationships. And I won't go into all the nuance there, but saying that somebody else that was an attendee was like, yeah, I thought there was a whole different direction that this conversation could have gone. But I think the parallel that I'm drawing here is that having the mental space and time freedom that FI allows you to have is to try and settle all of these problems that you've basically just kept at bay, right? The same way that you talked about your career and how to have a successful year, all you got to do is really execute on two or three things and keep the balls in the air, keep the wall from falling over, whatever analogy you want to use. It's the same thing with life, right? Is if ultimately, yeah, you have all this chaos that, or stressors, whatever word you want to use in your life, you're trying to keep all of those things at bay while still trying to do the things that ultimately can't slip, right? By, hey, I have to bring in this income because we have these expenses, whatever. So when that ultimate problem is solved of those money problems, now all those other issues that you've been keeping at bay now have time to say, hey, I'm still here. Like, now you got time to resolve me. So, I mean, I think that's it's a great insight because it's not related just to a mental health concern. It could be a relationship. It could be physical health. It could be any number of things that you have. I think that the Donegans have done in some of their programming that I think is really good is outlining all the different facets of life. And if I give the analogy of, okay, let's say we have 9 different facets of our life. Well, you only have a 6-burner stove. So 3 of those things are getting cooked and 3 of them are being left, not getting touched. And so there's different phases of life where you're shifting those proverbial pots, but when you start to solve some of them, there's more capacity to be like, oh yeah, hey, here's this dish that wasn't getting cooked. Now I need to make this a priority and bring it in line with the rest of my life. So mixing many analogies here, but hopefully everybody gets the
I'm
point.
just cooking that dish, Elliot. I'm putting in the work
That's
now,
right.
and thankfully have the time to do it. And it's all about just trying to have the best, healthiest life possible. One thing I didn't mention
That's
before
right.
is that I've solved for the physical health aspect as much as I possibly can. I mean, and make that a part of my daily life. So mental health just needs to fall in line as well.
That's right.
All right. Well, this has been a deep one and a longer one, but I appreciate you listening and thank you for bouncing all of this off of you.
Of course, and hopefully I've added some little bit of value in our
Yeah,
session here.
absolutely. All right. Well, I will talk to you in the next one. All right. See you,
Till
Elliot.
next time. See you, Josh.